My husband surprised me with a solitary trip to Paris. As I was getting into the taxi, our old gardener grabbed my wrist. "Ma'am, please don't go. Just trust me." I pretended to leave, but I doubled back and hid in the guest house. An hour later, a black van pulled up and I stopped breathing when I saw, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw the black suitcase sitting by our front door. Jared had this pleased expression on his face, like a man who'd just solved a difficult puzzle, and he kept checking his watch every few minutes. After 34 years of marriage, I knew that look. It meant he was planning something, and experience had taught me that Jared's surprises rarely worked out in my favor. "Paris, Lorene," he announced, spreading his arms wide like he was presenting me with the world itself. "Just you and me, sweetheart. A second honeymoon." I stood in our kitchen, coffee mug halfway to my lips, trying to process what he'd just said. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting golden light across the granite countertops I'd spent months choosing 3 years ago. Everything looked normal. The same yellow curtains, the same ceramic rooster collection on the windowsill, the same husband I'd been making breakfast for since 1990. But something felt different, like the air pressure had changed. "Paris?" I repeated, setting down my mug. "Jared, we can't just drop everything and go to Paris. I have my book club on Thursday, and the Hendersons' anniversary party on Saturday, and—" "Already taken care of," he interrupted, that same satisfied smile spreading wider. "I called Linda Henderson myself, told her you weren't feeling well and needed some time away to recover." The words hit me like cold water. "You told them I wasn't feeling well?" "Jared, there's nothing wrong with me." He waved his hand dismissively. "Just a little white lie, sweetheart. Besides, you have been looking tired lately. A trip to Paris will do you good." I wanted to argue, to point out that I felt perfectly fine, but something in his tone made me hesitate. There was an edge to his voice that I'd been hearing more often lately. Impatient, almost condescending, like he was talking to a child who didn't understand adult decisions. The taxi arrived exactly at noon. I watched from the living room window as it pulled into our driveway, its yellow paint bright against the gray December sky. My suitcase, the one Jared had packed for me while I was supposedly getting ready, sat heavy in my hand. I hadn't checked what he'd put in it. Another small surrender in a marriage full of them. "Come on, Lorene," Jared called from the doorway. "We don't want to miss our flight." I took one last look around our house. 24 years we'd lived here, ever since Jared's promotion at the insurance company had made the mortgage payments possible. Every corner held memories. The living room where we'd hosted Christmas dinners, the den where I'd spent countless evenings reading while he watched television, the kitchen where I'd learned to make his mother's pot roast recipe, even though it was too salty for my taste. As I stepped outside, the December air bit at my cheeks. That's when I saw Spencer in the side garden, kneeling beside the winter roses he'd been tending for the past 15 years. Our eyes met across the frost-covered lawn, and something passed between us. A look I couldn't quite interpret. Concern, maybe, or warning. Spencer had been our gardener since 2009, when Jared decided our yard needed professional attention. Most people saw him as just the hired help, but Spencer had become something more to me over the years. He was the kind of man who noticed things. When the roses needed extra water during a dry spell, when the gutters were clogging with autumn leaves, when I seemed particularly quiet after one of Jared's criticisms about my cooking or my housekeeping, or my failure to understand whatever point he was trying to make about politics or money or the proper way to load a dishwasher. The taxi driver was loading our bags into the trunk when Spencer suddenly stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. He walked toward us with unusual urgency, his work boots crunching on the gravel driveway. "Mrs. Holloway," he called out, his voice carrying an odd note of intensity. "Spencer," I replied, surprised by his approach. Usually he kept to himself during working hours, maintaining the professional distance that Jared preferred. Ma'am, please don't go. The words stopped me cold. I turned fully to face him, noting the way his weathered hands trembled slightly, the deep creases of worry around his brown eyes. Spencer was 72 years old, a man who'd seen enough of life to know when something wasn't right. "Just trust me," he continued, stepping closer. His voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "Please, Mrs. Holloway, don't get in that car." Behind me, I could hear Jared's footsteps on the gravel, his impatience growing. "What's the problem here, Spencer?" "No problem, sir," Spencer replied quickly, but his eyes never left mine. "Just wishing Mrs. Holloway a safe trip." I felt caught between them, my husband of 34 years, and this man who'd tended our garden with such quiet dedication. There was something in Spencer's expression, a desperate sincerity that made my chest tighten with inexplicable fear. "Lorene," Jared's voice cut through my thoughts. "We need to leave now, or we'll miss our flight." I looked back at Spencer one more time. He gave me the slightest nod, as if he understood that I had to make a choice in that moment. Trust my husband's plan, or trust the instinct that was telling me something was terribly wrong. "Coming!" I called to Jared, then lowered my voice for Spencer. "I'll be fine. Take care of the roses while I'm gone." As I approached the taxi, my mind raced. 34 years of marriage had taught me to read the subtle signs of Jared's moods, and today something felt different. The forced cheerfulness, the sudden spontaneity so unlike his usually methodical nature, the way he'd arranged everything without consulting me first. It all added up to something I couldn't name, but definitely didn't like. I reached for the taxi door handle, then stopped. "Actually," I said, turning back toward Jared, "I forgot my reading glasses. You know I can't sleep on planes without them." Jared's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lorene, we don't have time." "It'll just take a minute," I insisted, already walking back toward the house. "Go ahead and get settled in the car. I'll be right back." Inside, I grabbed my glasses from the nightstand, but instead of returning to the taxi immediately, I moved to the bedroom window that faced the backyard. From there, I could see Spencer still standing by the rose garden, his attention focused on the taxi where Jared was now checking his phone with obvious agitation. Something about Spencer's warning had lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. In 15 years of working for us, he'd never interfered in our personal affairs, never offered unsolicited advice, never shown anything but polite respect for the boundary between employer and employee. For him to risk his job by trying to stop me from leaving meant he knew something I didn't. I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning to the taxi, I slipped out the back door and made my way to the guest house, a small cottage we'd built in 2012 for visiting family members who never came. From its front window, I had a clear view of our driveway and the main house, but the angle of the building would hide me from anyone approaching from the street. I watched as Jared grew increasingly agitated by my absence. He got out of the taxi twice, checking his phone and looking toward the house with an expression I'd never seen before. Not concern for his missing wife, but irritation at a plan going awry. When he finally went inside to find me, I heard him calling my name with growing frustration. 20 minutes later, he emerged alone, spoke briefly to the taxi driver, and sent the car away. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call that lasted several minutes. I couldn't hear his words, but his body language spoke volumes, sharp gestures, pacing steps, the kind of animated conversation that suggested he was explaining a problem to someone who wouldn't be happy to hear about it. That's when I knew Spencer had been right to warn me. Whatever was supposed to happen during that trip to Paris, my absence had just disrupted it. I settled into the guest house's small armchair to wait, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in decades, I had chosen to trust my own instincts over my husband's plans, and despite the terror of not knowing what I was hiding from, there was something liberating about that choice. The afternoon stretched ahead of me like an unexplored country, full of terrible possibilities and the promise of truth. An hour later, I heard the rumble of an engine in our driveway, but it wasn't the taxi returning. This was something heavier, more substantial. I moved to the window and felt my blood turn to ice when I saw what was parked outside our house. A black van with tinted windows sat in the exact spot where the taxi had been. The black van sat in our driveway like a predator that had found its prey. From the safety of the guest house window, I watched as two men emerged from the vehicle, both wearing dark clothes that seemed deliberately unremarkable. They moved with the kind of casual confidence that comes from having done something many times before, and that thought sent ice through my veins. The first man was tall and lean, probably in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of forgettable face you'd pass on the street without a second glance. But it was the second man who made my breath catch in my throat. Even from a distance, I recognized the stocky build and carefully styled brown hair that Jared's best friend Marcus had been sporting since college. Marcus, who'd been the best man at our wedding, who'd spent countless evenings in our living room watching football and complaining about his ex-wife's alimony payments. Marcus, who was now walking toward my front door carrying a large black case that looked suspiciously like the kind professionals used for delicate equipment. I pressed myself against the window frame, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why was Marcus here when I was supposed to be on a plane to Paris with Jared? And who was the stranger with him? The questions multiplied in my mind like bacteria in a petri dish, each one more unsettling than the last. Jared met them at the front door, and even from my hiding spot 50 feet away, I could see the tension in his posture. He gestured impatiently toward the street, then ushered both men inside quickly, like he was worried about neighbors seeing them. The front door closed with a finality that made my stomach clench. For the next 30 minutes, I sat in the guest house's uncomfortable wicker chair, straining to hear any sound from the main house. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement through our living room windows, shadows passing back and forth, the suggestion of people working on something that required them to move furniture around. At one point, I saw the stranger setting up what looked like a tripod near our fireplace, though I couldn't make out what he was mounting on it. The winter sun was beginning its early descent when Spencer appeared at the guest house door. I nearly jumped out of my skin at his gentle knock, having been so focused on watching the main house that I'd forgotten about everything else. "Mrs. Holloway," he said softly when I cracked the door open. "Are you all right?" I let him inside, grateful for the solid presence of another human being who seemed to be on my side. Spencer looked older in the afternoon light, more fragile somehow, but his eyes were sharp with concern and something else, a kind of grim determination I'd never seen in him before. "Spencer, what's happening? Why did you tell me not to go?" He ran a weathered hand through his thinning gray hair, a gesture I'd seen him make countless times when he was trying to find the right words to explain something complex. "Ma'am, I've been working around this house for 15 years. I've learned to notice things, to pay attention when something doesn't seem right." "What kind of things?" Spencer moved to the window, peering cautiously toward the main house. "Your husband's been making a lot of phone calls lately. Calls he doesn't want you to overhear. I work in the garden, Mrs. Holloway. People forget I'm there, and sound carries through open windows." My mouth went dry. "What kind of calls?" "Calls about you, ma'am. About your mental state." The words hit me like a physical blow. "My mental state? Spencer, there's nothing wrong with my mental state." "I know that, Mrs. Holloway. You're one of the sharpest people I've ever met, but I've heard him talking to doctors, to lawyers, using words like declining and early onset and dangerous to herself." I sank into the chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "That's impossible. Jared would never. We've been married for 34 years. He loves me." Spencer's expression was gentle but firm. "Ma'am, with respect, love doesn't make a man lie to medical professionals about his wife's condition, and it doesn't make him research private psychiatric facilities that specialize in long-term care for patients with diminished capacity." The room seemed to tilt around me. "Psychiatric facilities? I'm sorry, Mrs. Holloway. I know this is hard to hear." But 3 weeks ago, I was trimming the hedges outside his office window when he had a long conversation with someone from a place called Millbrook Manor. It's a private facility about 2 hours north of here. Very expensive. Very discreet. I tried to process what Spencer was telling me, but my mind kept rejecting the information like an immune system fighting off infection. Jared researching psychiatric facilities? Jared telling doctors I was mentally declining? It was absurd, impossible, completely contrary to everything I believed about our marriage. But why? I whispered. Even if what you're saying is true, why would he want to? To put me away. Spencer was quiet for a long moment, his attention fixed on the main house. Mrs. Holloway, you inherited a substantial amount of money when your parents died 5 years ago, didn't you? The question seemed to come from nowhere, but I nodded. $2 million. My father was very careful with his investments, and my mother never spent money on anything unnecessary. But Jared knows about that. We put it in a joint account. Actually, ma'am, you didn't. I stared at him. What do you mean? I mean the money is still in your name only. I know because I helped you carry some of the paperwork in from your car last month when you came back from the bank. Some of it fell out of your folder, and I couldn't help but see the account statements as I picked them up. My mind raced back to that afternoon. I'd been meeting with our financial advisor about updating our investment portfolio, and yes, I remembered carrying a stack of papers. I also remembered Spencer helping me with my packages when I struggled with the front door. At the time, I'd been grateful for his assistance. Now, I realized it might have saved my life. $2 million, Spencer continued carefully, is a lot of money, especially for a man who's been struggling with gambling debts for the past 2 years. The world stopped spinning. Gambling debts? I'm sorry, Mrs. Holloway. I probably shouldn't say anything, but I've seen the letters. The ones that come in unmarked envelopes that he picks up from the mailbox himself. The ones that make his hands shake when he reads them. I felt something cold and sick spreading through my chest. How much does he owe? Spencer's silence was answer enough. Through the guest house window, we watched as Marcus and the stranger carried several pieces of equipment back to the van. Whatever they'd been doing inside our house, they were apparently finished. I saw Jared shake hands with both men, the gesture of someone concluding a business transaction, and then the van pulled out of our driveway as quietly as it had arrived. Mrs. Holloway, Spencer said quietly, I think you need to see what they did in there. We waited another hour until we were certain Jared had left the house. Spencer had watched him drive away in his silver sedan about 20 minutes after the van departed, presumably to pick me up from wherever he thought I'd gone when I didn't return to the taxi. Using Spencer's key, something I hadn't known he possessed, we entered through the back door. The house felt different immediately, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly how. It was still our home, still furnished with the same pieces we'd accumulated over decades of marriage, but something essential had changed. It didn't take long to find what the men had been doing. In the living room, tucked discreetly behind our family photos on the mantelpiece, was a small camera no bigger than a button. I found another one in the kitchen, positioned to capture the breakfast table where Jared and I had our morning coffee every day. A third was hidden in our bedroom, angled to record our bed and the adjoining bathroom door. They're watching me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Spencer nodded grimly. Documenting everything you do, everything you say, building a case. A case for what? Proving you're not competent to manage your own affairs. In Jared's office, Spencer showed me something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind a false back in his filing cabinet were medical forms, already partially filled out, describing symptoms I'd never experienced and behaviors I'd never exhibited. Confusion, disorientation, episodes of aggressive paranoia, inability to recognize familiar faces or remember recent events. All of it lies. All of it written in Jared's careful handwriting. He's been planning this for months, I realized, sinking into his desk chair. The trip to Paris, It was supposed to be when I disappeared, wasn't it? When I got lost and confused in a foreign country, proving that I couldn't take care of myself anymore. Spencer's expression was grim. And then he'd have legal grounds to have you declared incompetent, with power of attorney over your finances and the authority to make decisions about your care. I thought about the psychiatric facility Spencer had mentioned, the expensive and discreet Millbrook Manor, a place where inconvenient wives could be tucked away while their husbands gained access to $2 million inheritances. A place where a woman could disappear completely, legally and permanently, while the world believed she was receiving the best possible care for her tragic condition. The man I'd loved for 34 years, the man I'd made breakfast for every morning and dinner for every night, the man who'd held my hand at my parents' funerals and promised to love me in sickness and in health, had been systematically planning to erase me from my own life. As I sat in his office, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal, I felt something shift inside me. The fear was still there, cold and sharp in my chest, but it was joined by something else now. Something harder and more dangerous. Jared thought he was dealing with a confused old woman who could be easily manipulated and discarded. He was about to discover exactly how wrong he was. I stood up from his desk chair and looked at Spencer, who had been watching me with concerned eyes. "How long do we have before he comes back?" Spencer checked his watch. "Probably an hour, maybe 2. He'll want to look like he's been searching for you." "Good," I said, my voice steadier than I'd felt in hours. "Because we have work to do." For the first time since Spencer had warned me not to get in that taxi, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. Jared wanted to play games with my sanity and my freedom? Fine. But this time, I was going to be the one making the rules. The sound of Jared's car pulling into the driveway sent Spencer and me scrambling back to the guest house like conspirators fleeing a crime scene. We made it just as the front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, followed by Jared's voice calling my name with an edge of panic that would have seemed genuine if I hadn't spent the last 2 hours discovering what kind of man I'd really been married to. "Lorene! Lorene, where are you?" "There." From the guest house window, I watched my husband of 34 years pace our front porch, his cell phone pressed to his ear. Even from a distance, I could see the agitation in his movements, the way he ran his free hand through his thinning hair, the sharp gestures he made while talking to whoever was on the other end of that call. "He's reporting to someone," Spencer observed quietly, standing beside me at the window. "Probably the same people who sent that van." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air seeping through the guest house walls. The idea that strangers were involved in whatever Jared was planning made everything infinitely more terrifying. This wasn't just a husband with gambling debts trying to access his wife's inheritance. This was organized, professional, systematic. "Spencer," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "how long have you known about the phone calls?" He was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "The first one I overheard was about 3 months ago. Mr. Jared was in his office with the window cracked open. It was one of those warm October days, you remember? I was raking leaves right underneath, and I heard him talking to someone about accelerating the timeline. 3 months. While I'd been planning our Thanksgiving dinner and ordering Christmas gifts for the grandchildren I'd probably never see again, Jared had been plotting my destruction with the methodical precision of a man planning a business merger. What exactly did he say? Spencer's expression grew even more troubled. He said the documentation needed to be more comprehensive, that he needed evidence of episodes, not just paperwork. He kept saying things like, behaviors that can't be explained away, and witnesses who would testify if necessary. The words hit me like physical blows. Episodes, witnesses, testify. This wasn't just about stealing my money. This was about erasing me completely, turning me into a cautionary tale about a woman who'd lost her mind and needed to be protected from herself. "There's more," Spencer continued reluctantly. "About 6 weeks ago, I heard him talking to someone about medications. natural supplements that could cause confusion, memory problems, things that wouldn't show up on standard blood tests. My hand flew to my throat as the implications crashed over me. The vitamins. Ma'am? The new vitamins Jared's been bringing me every morning for the past month. He said they were good for brain health, for preventing memory loss as I get older. I felt sick to my stomach. Spencer, I've been taking them religiously. He's been so insistent about it, so concerned about my health. Spencer's face went pale. Mrs. Holloway, have you been feeling different lately? More tired than usual? Having trouble concentrating? I thought back over the past several weeks, forcing myself to really examine how I'd been feeling instead of dismissing the symptoms as normal signs of aging. There had been mornings when I felt foggy, afternoons when I couldn't quite remember what I'd done with my keys, or whether I'd already watered the plants. Small things that I'd attributed to getting older. But now. He's been drugging me, I said, the words coming out flat and emotionless because the alternative was screaming. My own husband has been slowly poisoning me to make me seem confused and forgetful. Through the window, I could see Jared ending his phone call and heading back into the house. A few minutes later, lights began coming on throughout our home as he searched for me, calling my name with increasing desperation. We need to get back inside before he calls the police, I told Spencer. If he reports me missing, this whole thing could spiral out of control. Spencer nodded, but his expression was worried. Mrs. Holloway, what are you going to tell him? He's going to want to know where you've been. I had been thinking about that exact question for the past 30 minutes, and I'd come to a conclusion that surprised me with its clarity. I'm going to tell him the truth, or at least a version of it. Ma'am? I'm going to tell him that I suddenly felt dizzy and confused when we got to the airport, that I couldn't remember why we were going to Paris or even where Paris was, that I panicked and took a taxi home, but I've been sitting in the guest house for the past few hours trying to piece together what happened to me. Spencer stared at me. You're going to pretend to have the symptoms he's been trying to create. Exactly. If Jared thinks his plan is working ahead of schedule, he might get careless, reveal more than he intends to. And meanwhile, we document everything. It was a dangerous game, pretending to lose my mind while secretly maintaining perfect clarity. But it was the only way I could think of to stay one step ahead of whatever Jared was planning. If he believed I was already showing signs of serious mental decline, he might accelerate his timeline, and in doing so, make mistakes that would expose the full scope of his conspiracy. Spencer and I agreed that he would continue working in the garden as if nothing had happened, keeping his eyes and ears open for any further developments. Meanwhile, I would return to the house and begin the most challenging performance of my life. I found Jared in our bedroom, sitting on the edge of our bed with his head in his hands. When I knocked softly on the doorframe, he looked up with an expression of such relief that for a moment, I almost forgot what I'd discovered about him. Lorene! Thank God, where have you been? I've been worried sick. I let my voice trail off, adding a note of confusion that wasn't entirely feigned. Jared, I don't understand what happened. We were at the airport, and suddenly I couldn't remember why we were there. He stood up quickly, crossing the room to take my hands in his. His touch felt different now, not comforting, but calculating. What do you mean, sweetheart? Paris, I said, shaking my head as if trying to clear it. You kept saying we were going to Paris, but I couldn't remember booking a trip. I couldn't remember wanting to go anywhere. And then when we got to the airport, I looked at all those people and all those signs, and I got so scared. Jared's eyes sharpened with what looked like professional interest. Scared of what? I don't know. Everything. Nothing. I felt like I was in a place I'd never seen before, surrounded by strangers, and I couldn't understand why you were trying to make me get on an airplane. I sat down heavily on our bed, putting my head in my hands. I took a taxi home, but then I couldn't remember where I'd put my house keys. I've been sitting in the guest house all afternoon, waiting for you to come home and explain what's happening to me. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway downstairs. When I looked up, Jared was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not concern or love or even confusion, but something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice taking on the gentle, patronizing tone people use with small children or very sick people. "I think you might be more tired than we realized. Maybe we should make an appointment with Dr. Morrison, have him take a look at you." Dr. Morrison, who had been our family physician for the past 15 years, and who would undoubtedly find nothing wrong with me because there was nothing wrong with me. Which meant Jared was planning to take me somewhere else, to one of the doctors Spencer had mentioned, the ones who specialized in finding problems that didn't exist. "Do you think that's necessary?" I asked, letting a note of fear creep into my voice. "Maybe I just need some rest." "Maybe," Jared agreed, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. "But Laureen, what you're describing, the confusion, the memory problems, the disorientation, these could be signs of something serious. Something serious, like early-onset dementia or Alzheimer's, or any number of conditions that would require long-term specialized care. The kind of care provided by expensive private facilities like Millbrook Manor." "I'm scared, Jared," I said. And for once, I didn't have to fake the emotion in my voice. He sat down beside me and put his arm around my shoulders, pulling me close in what should have been a comforting gesture. Instead, it felt like being embraced by a snake. "Don't be scared, sweetheart. I'm going to take care of everything. I'm going to make sure you get the best possible help." The best possible help. Not the help I needed because I didn't need any help. The help he needed me to have, which was an entirely different thing. That night, I lay awake beside the man I'd shared a bed with for over 3 decades, listening to his steady breathing and planning my next move. Every few hours, I heard the soft click of our bedroom door opening and closing, followed by the whispered sound of footsteps in the hallway. Jared was checking on me, making sure I was still there, still under his control. Around 3 in the morning, I heard him talking quietly on the phone in his office downstairs. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, and when he finally returned to bed, he smelled faintly of cigarettes, a habit he'd supposedly given up years ago, but apparently resumed under stress. In the darkness, I began to understand the true scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just a husband trying to steal his wife's inheritance. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to strip me of everything that made me human, my autonomy, my dignity, my very identity. And if Spencer hadn't warned me, if I'd gotten on that plane to Paris, I would have walked straight into a trap that would have destroyed my life completely. The next morning, Jared brought me my vitamins with breakfast, just as he had every morning for the past month. This time, I knew exactly what they were intended to do. "Here you go, sweetheart," he said, setting the pills beside my orange juice with the same casual affection he'd shown for 34 years. "These will help with your energy levels." I palmed the pills instead of swallowing them, waiting until he left for his morning shower before spitting them into a tissue. Later, when I was certain he was gone, I would give them to Spencer, who had offered to take them to someone he knew who could have them analyzed. As I sat at our breakfast table, surrounded by the familiar comfort of our morning routine, I realized that everything I'd believed about my life had been a carefully constructed illusion. The loving husband, the secure marriage, the peaceful retirement we'd been planning, none of it had been real. But unlike the victim Jared thought he was creating, I was not confused, not helpless, and certainly not willing to disappear quietly into whatever nightmare he had planned for me. The war for my life had begun, and I intended to win it. The pills Spencer took for analysis came back exactly as we'd suspected, a cocktail of supplements laced with mild sedatives and cognitive suppressants that would cause exactly the symptoms Jared claimed to be concerned about. Memory fog, confusion, difficulty concentrating. Nothing that would show up on a routine blood test, but enough to make a 64-year-old woman seem like she was experiencing the early stages of dementia. The person who analyzed these says they're actually quite sophisticated, Spencer told me as we sat in the guest house 3 days later. Whoever formulated this knew exactly what they were doing. The dosages are calculated to create symptoms without causing obvious harm. I stared at the small plastic bag containing the evidence of my husband's betrayal. How long would it take for these to clear my system? About a week? Maybe less if you drink plenty of water and get some exercise. A week. For 7 days, I would need to continue pretending to experience symptoms that were slowly fading from my system while documenting everything Jared did and said. It was like being an undercover agent in my own home, gathering evidence against the man who'd promised to love and honor me until death do us part. The irony wasn't lost on me. Death would indeed part us. He was just trying to arrange it differently than we'd planned. "Mrs. Holloway," Spencer said carefully, "there's something else you need to know." I looked up from the pills, noting the grim expression on his weathered face. In the past few days, Spencer had become my anchor in a world that had turned completely upside down. His steady presence and unwavering loyalty were the only things keeping me sane as I navigated the minefield my life had become. "What is it?" "I did some research on that place I mentioned, Millbrook Manor. It's not just expensive, it's exclusive. They specialize in long-term care for patients whose families want discretion." "What kind of discretion?" Spencer pulled out a small notebook where he'd been recording everything we'd discovered. "The kind where patients check in but their families rarely visit. Where medical records are kept confidential and communication with the outside world is strictly controlled for the patient's own good." The temperature in the guest house seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You're talking about a place where people disappear." "I'm talking about a place where inconvenient relatives can be stored indefinitely while their families gain control of their assets, all perfectly legal, all documented as necessary medical care." I felt something cold and sharp twist in my stomach. Jared hadn't just been planning to steal my inheritance, he'd been planning to erase me from existence entirely. A living death that would allow him to access my $2 million while maintaining the sympathetic image of a devoted husband caring for his tragically ill wife. "How much does a place like that cost?" Spencer consulted his notebook. "About $8,000 a month for basic care. More if the patient requires special handling or additional security measures." $8,000 a month. Even with my inheritance, that would add up quickly. Unless Jared was planning for my stay to be relatively short. The thought made my hands shake as I considered the implications. Perhaps the plan wasn't just confinement. Perhaps it was something far worse, disguised as natural deterioration in a patient with advancing dementia. "Spencer, I need you to help me with something." "Anything, Mrs. Holloway." "I need to search Jared's office more thoroughly. If he's been planning this for months, there has to be more documentation. Financial records, correspondence, maybe even a timeline." Spencer nodded. "He goes to his poker game every Thursday night. Stays out until at least midnight." Thursday night. 2 days away. It would give me time to prepare, to think through exactly what I was looking for and how to find it without leaving any trace of my search. That afternoon, I continued my performance as a confused and frightening wife. When Jared came home from work, I met him at the door with a story about forgetting how to use the washing machine, standing in the laundry room for an hour, trying to remember which button to push. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said, his voice full of practiced patience. "These things happen. Why don't you let me handle the laundry from now on?" Another small surrender of independence. Another piece of evidence that I couldn't manage basic household tasks. I wondered how many of these moments he was documenting, building his case piece by piece. "Jared," I said, letting my voice tremble slightly. "I'm scared. What's happening to me?" He guided me to the living room sofa, settling beside me with the kind of tender concern that would have melted my heart a week ago. Now it made my skin crawl. "I've been thinking about that, Lorene. I made an appointment for you with a specialist. Dr. Harrison comes highly recommended for patients with memory issues." "Dr. Harrison. Not Dr. Morrison," our longtime family physician who might actually give me a clean bill of health, a specialist who undoubtedly already knew what diagnosis Jared wanted him to provide. When? Tomorrow afternoon. Just a consultation, nothing to worry about. Tomorrow. They were moving faster than I'd expected, which meant I was running out of time to gather evidence. If Dr. Harrison declared me mentally incompetent, Jared could have me committed to Millbrook Manor within days. That night, after Jared fell asleep, I slipped out of bed and made my way carefully downstairs to his office. Using the small flashlight I'd hidden in my bathrobe pocket, I began a systematic search of every drawer, every file, every space where he might have hidden additional documentation. What I found was worse than anything Spencer and I had imagined. In a locked drawer, opened with a hairpin technique Spencer had taught me earlier, I discovered a complete dossier on my mental health dating back 6 months. Detailed notes about my supposed episodes of confusion, memory lapses that had never happened, aggressive outbursts I'd never had. All of it carefully documented in Jared's handwriting, with dates and times and witnesses. Marcus had apparently been helping with the documentation, providing corroborating testimony about my declining condition. According to these files, I'd had 3 separate incidents in the past month where I'd become violent and irrational, threatening both Jared and Marcus with kitchen knives. It was pure fiction, but it was meticulously crafted fiction that would be extremely difficult to disprove. I found correspondence with Millbrook Manor going back 4 months, including a detailed care plan and financial arrangements. The initial payment alone was $50,000, with monthly fees of $8,000 thereafter. Jared had already signed the contracts, but it was the file labeled Timeline that made my blood run cold. Phase 1. Establish pattern of cognitive decline through documentation and witness testimony. Status. Complete. Phase 2. Medical evaluation confirming dementia diagnosis. Status. Scheduled for December 15th. December 15th. Tomorrow. Phase 3. Emergency commitment following violent episode. Status. Prepared. Phase 4. Transfer to long-term care facility. Status. Arrangements complete. Phase 5. Access to inheritance and insurance proceeds. Status. Pending. Insurance proceeds. I flipped through more pages until I found what I was looking for. A life insurance policy I'd never known existed, taken out in my name 18 months ago. The beneficiary was listed as my beloved husband, Jared, and the payout was $1 million. My hands shook as I photographed each page with the small digital camera Spencer had given me. Jared wasn't just planning to have me committed to Millbrook Manor. He was planning for me to die there, making it look like the natural progression of a tragic illness while he collected both my inheritance and my insurance money. $3 million total, enough to pay off his gambling debts and fund a very comfortable retirement. The final document in the file was a draft of my obituary, written in Jared's careful handwriting. Lorene Margaret Holloway passed peacefully on date to be determined after a courageous battle with early-onset dementia. She was surrounded by love and receiving the finest possible care at the time of her passing. I sat in his office chair, surrounded by evidence of the most elaborate betrayal I could have imagined, and felt something inside me break completely. Not my spirit, that had grown stronger with each revelation. What broke was the last vestige of the woman who had believed in the goodness of her marriage, who had trusted her husband with her life, who had been willing to overlook small cruelties in favor of maintaining peace. That woman was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. I photographed everything, copied what I could, and returned the files to exactly where I'd found them. Then I made my way back upstairs to lie beside the man who was planning my murder, and spent the remaining hours until dawn planning his destruction instead. The appointment with Dr. Harrison was scheduled for 2 o'clock the next afternoon. I had less than 12 hours to prepare for the performance of my life, one that would determine whether I walked out of his office a free woman or was committed to a psychiatric facility where I would slowly and quietly disappear. But Jared had made one critical mistake in his elaborate plan. He had underestimated the woman he'd been married to for 34 years. He thought he was dealing with a confused, frightened victim who would go quietly into whatever nightmare he'd prepared for her. He was about to discover exactly how wrong he was. As I lay in bed listening to his peaceful breathing, I smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would be the day Jared learned that his wife was far more formidable than he'd ever imagined. And unlike his carefully documented fiction, my revenge would be very, very real. Dr. Harrison's office was exactly what I'd expected. All mahogany furniture and expensive diplomas, designed to project authority and trustworthiness. The kind of place where families brought their loved ones to receive devastating diagnoses delivered with professional compassion. What I hadn't expected was how young he looked. Probably no more than 40, with the kind of eager ambition that made him dangerous. Jared sat beside me in the consultation room, playing the role of concerned husband with an expertise that made my skin crawl. His hand rested protectively on my knee while he answered Dr. Harrison's questions about my recent episodes with carefully rehearsed sorrow. The confusion started about 3 months ago, Jared explained, his voice heavy with manufactured grief. Small things at first. She'd forget conversations we'd had, lose track of time, get lost driving to places she's been going for years. Dr. Harrison nodded sympathetically, making notes in what I assumed was my newly created medical file. And the aggressive episodes? Those started more recently. About a month ago, I found her in the kitchen at 2 a.m, holding a knife and insisting that strangers had been in our house. When I tried to calm her down, she threatened me. It was a masterful performance, full of the kind of specific details that would be difficult to dispute. The fact that none of it had ever happened was irrelevant. Jared was creating a medical record that would support whatever Dr. Harrison had already been paid to conclude. Mrs. Holloway, Dr. Harrison turned to me with the patronizing gentleness reserved for children and the mentally impaired. Can you tell me what year it is? This was it. The moment when I had to decide how far to take my own performance. If I appeared too competent, Dr. Harrison would have no grounds for the diagnosis Jared was expecting. But if I seemed too impaired, I might be committed immediately, before I had a chance to execute my own plan. I let confusion flicker across my face, as if the question itself was difficult to process. Year? I'm not sure. 1990-something? Jared's hand tightened on my knee, not a comforting gesture, but a signal of satisfaction. From his perspective, my confusion was right on schedule. Can you tell me the name of the current president? I stared blankly at Dr. Harrison, then looked to Jared as if seeking help. There's a president? Of what? Dr. Harrison exchanged a meaningful glance with my husband. Mrs. Holloway, do you know where you are right now? I think. Is this a hospital? Jared said we were going shopping, but this doesn't look like a store. I let my voice take on the querulous tone of someone genuinely confused and frightened. I want to go home now. I don't like it here. What followed was an hour of psychological tests that I failed with carefully calculated precision. I couldn't remember 3 simple words after 5 minutes. I couldn't draw a clock face with the numbers in the right places. I became agitated when asked to perform basic arithmetic, claiming that numbers didn't make sense anymore. Through it all, Jared sat beside me like a devoted husband bearing witness to his wife's tragic decline. He provided additional details about my condition when prompted, each one more damaging than the last. According to him, I'd been wandering the neighborhood at night, forgetting to turn off appliances, becoming violent when corrected about obvious mistakes. The hardest part, Jared told Dr. Sao, Harrison while I sat staring vacantly at the wall, is that she still has moments of clarity, times when she seems almost like her old self. But they're getting rarer. Dr. Harrison nodded knowingly. That's very typical of early-stage dementia. The progression isn't always linear. Early-stage dementia. There it was. The diagnosis that would destroy my life, delivered with the same casual professionalism someone might use to discuss the weather. "What are our options?" Jared asked, his voice carefully modulated to suggest a man grappling with impossible choices. Given the severity of her symptoms and the documented episodes of violence, I would strongly recommend immediate residential care. Patients at this stage often benefit from a structured environment with 24-hour supervision. "You mean a nursing home?" "Something more specialized. There's an excellent facility called Millbrook Manor that deals specifically with cases like your wife's. They have experience with patients who exhibit aggressive tendencies alongside cognitive decline." I felt a chill of genuine terror as the trap closed around me with surgical precision. Everything was proceeding exactly according to Jared's timeline. In less than an hour, Dr. Harrison would sign commitment papers that would give Jared legal authority to have me transported to Millbrook Manor against my will. But I had one advantage that neither of them knew about: the small digital recorder hidden in my purse, documenting every word of their conspiracy. "Doctor," I said suddenly, my voice taking on a note of desperate clarity that made both men turn toward me. "I need to tell you something important." Jared's hand clamped down on my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. "Lorene, sweetheart? You're confused." "No," I insisted, pulling away from him with more strength than he expected. "I'm not confused. Not about this. Doctor, my husband has been putting things in my food, pills that make me feel sleepy and strange." Dr. Harrison's expression didn't change, but I caught the barely perceptible glance he exchanged with Jared. "Mrs. Holloway, paranoid ideation is very common in patients with your condition. The feeling that loved ones are trying to harm you is actually one of the classic symptoms of advancing dementia." "It's not paranoid if it's true," I said, reaching into my purse with shaking hands. "I have proof." What I pulled out wasn't the recorder, which I needed to keep hidden for now, but the plastic bag containing the pills Spencer had analyzed. I set it on Dr. Harrison's desk with a satisfying thud. "These are the vitamins my husband has been giving me every morning for the past month. I had them tested at an independent laboratory. They contain sedatives and cognitive suppressants that would cause exactly the symptoms you've been documenting." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. Jared's face had gone white, while Dr. Harrison stared at the pill bag as if it were a venomous snake. "Lorene," Jared said carefully, "where did you get those pills tested? You've been at home with me every day." "Not every day, Jared. Not every hour. And I haven't been as confused as you thought I was." I stood up from my chair, feeling steadier and more clear-headed than I had in months. The fog that had been clouding my thoughts for weeks was finally lifting, replaced by a crystalline clarity that made everything sharp and bright. "Dr. Harrison," I continued, "I'm curious about something. How much did my husband pay you to provide a specific diagnosis today? And how long have you been working with Millbrook Manor to provide them with patients whose families want them? Disappeared?" Dr. Harrison's professional composure cracked for just a moment, long enough for me to see the guilt and fear underneath. "Mrs. Holloway, I think you're having another episode. Perhaps we should continue this evaluation another time, when you're feeling more settled." "I'm feeling perfectly settled, thank you. What I'm not feeling is patient." I opened my purse again and this time pulled out the small digital recorder, setting it beside the pill bag on his desk. "I've been recording this entire conversation, Doctor. Every word. Including your recommendation to commit me to a facility that you have a financial relationship with, based on a diagnosis you made before ever meeting me." Jared lunged for the recorder, but I was faster, snatching it back and holding it against my chest. 34 years of marriage, Jared, and I never once saw you move that quickly for anything that didn't benefit you directly. "Lorene, you don't understand what you're doing. You're sick. You need help. The only thing I need help with is getting away from you." I turned back to Dr. Harrison, who was now looking extremely uncomfortable in his expensive leather chair. I wonder what the medical licensing board would think about a psychiatrist who accepts bribes to provide false diagnoses, or what the police would say about a conspiracy to commit fraud and unlawful imprisonment. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat nervously. Mrs. Holloway, I think there's been some misunderstanding. Your husband brought you here because he's genuinely concerned about your welfare. No one is trying to hurt you. Really? Then explain this. I reached into my purse one final time and pulled out photocopies of the documents I'd found in Jared's office, the timeline, the correspondence with Millbrook Manor, and the life insurance policy I'd never known existed. Explain why my husband has been documenting fictional episodes of violence and confusion for the past 6 months. Explain why he's already signed contracts with Millbrook Manor and paid a $50,000 deposit for my long-term care. And most importantly, explain why he took out a $1 million life insurance policy on me 18 months ago without my knowledge or consent. I spread the documents across Dr. Harrison's desk like a poker player revealing a royal flush. This isn't about my mental health, gentlemen. This is about murder disguised as medical care. The room erupted into chaos. Jared started shouting that I was delusional, that I'd somehow fabricated the documents during one of my confused episodes. Dr. Harrison tried to maintain his professional demeanor while clearly calculating how quickly he could distance himself from whatever Jared had gotten him involved in. But I wasn't finished yet. I had one more card to play. "Spencer," I called loudly toward the closed office door. A moment later, my faithful gardener entered the room, followed by 2 people I'd never seen before. A woman in her 50s wearing a badge that identified her as a social worker, and a man in a police uniform. "Mrs. Holloway called us 3 days ago," the social worker explained to the stunned men. She was concerned that someone was trying to have her committed against her will for financial gain. "We've been investigating her claims." The police officer stepped forward. "Dr. Harrison, we need to speak with you about your relationship with Millbrook Manor and the suspicious number of emergency commitments you've processed in the past year." I watched as the carefully constructed web of lies and corruption began to unravel around Jared and his co-conspirators. 34 years of marriage had taught me to read my husband's expressions, and what I saw now was pure panic as he realized that his victim had become his hunter. "Spencer," I said, turning to the man who had saved my life with his warning about the Paris trip, "I believe we can go home now." As we left Dr. Harrison's office, I could hear Jared shouting my name behind us, his voice no longer filled with false concern, but with the raw desperation of a man watching his carefully planned future disappear. I didn't look back. After 34 years, I was finally moving forward. 6 months later, I stood in the garden of my new home, watching Spencer plant roses in soil that belonged to me alone. The house was smaller than the one I'd shared with Jared for 24 years, but every corner of it was honest. No hidden cameras, no secret documents, no medications disguised as vitamins. Just a peaceful cottage on 3 acres of land, 40 miles from the city where I'd nearly lost everything. The legal proceedings had taken 4 months to resolve completely. Jared was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit fraud, insurance fraud, and attempted unlawful imprisonment. Dr. Harrison lost his medical license and received 5 years for his role in what the prosecutor called a systematic scheme to defraud elderly patients and their families. Marcus, Jared's supposed best friend and co-conspirator, pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testimony against the others. It turned out that Marcus wasn't just helping Jared document my fictional episodes of dementia. He was part of a larger network that specialized in targeting wealthy, older adults for elaborate financial scams. The investigation that followed my case uncovered 12 other victims over the past 3 years, all of them women over 60 who had been systematically drugged, gaslighted, and committed to expensive private facilities while their assets were transferred to family members or caregivers. Some of them had died at Millbrook Manor under suspicious circumstances that were being investigated by federal authorities. I testified at every trial, telling my story with the same clarity and precision I'd used to document Jared's conspiracy. The prosecutors called me an ideal witness, calm, credible, and impossible to discredit because of the meticulous evidence I'd gathered. What they didn't understand was that testifying wasn't difficult for me because I was no longer afraid. Fear belonged to my old life, to the woman who had trusted too easily and questioned too little. The woman I'd become was someone different entirely. "Mrs. Holloway," Spencer called from the garden, "these roses should bloom beautifully next spring. The soil here is much better than what we had at the old house." I smiled, enjoying the casual way he said "we," as if there had never been any question that he would come with me when I moved. After the trials ended, I'd offered Spencer a position as my estate manager, with a salary of $3,000 a month and a small cottage on the property for his own use. It was the first time in my adult life that I'd made a major decision without consulting anyone else, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Spencer had become more than an employee. He was my closest friend, my confidant, and the person who had literally saved my life by warning me not to get on that plane to Paris. Without his intervention, I would have walked straight into Jared's trap and disappeared as completely as if I'd never existed. "The roses will be lovely," I agreed, settling into one of the wicker chairs I'd placed on the back patio. "But I think what I enjoy most about this garden is that it belongs to us." Spencer paused in his planting, understanding immediately what I meant. This wasn't a garden maintained for someone else's pleasure, designed to impress neighbors or increase property values. This was a space where we could grow whatever we wanted, however we wanted, without anyone's permission or approval. The financial settlement from Jared's crimes had been substantial. The court awarded me full restitution for the money he'd stolen, plus punitive damages for emotional distress. My inheritance was intact, supplemented now by the proceeds from selling our old house and everything in it that I didn't want to keep. More importantly, the life insurance policy Jared had taken out without my knowledge had been invalidated due to fraud, and the insurance company had paid me an additional settlement to avoid further legal action. I was, by any measure, a wealthy woman, wealthy enough to live exactly as I chose for the rest of my life. What I chose was simplicity. The new house had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen large enough for cooking but small enough for easy maintenance, and windows that faced the garden from every room. I'd furnished it with pieces I actually liked, rather than items chosen to impress visitors who rarely came. My books had their own room now, lined up on shelves Spencer had built according to my specifications. I kept very few reminders of my previous life. The wedding photos were gone, of course, along with most of the expensive furniture and decorative objects that had cluttered our old home. What I'd kept were the things that had belonged to me before my marriage: my grandmother's china, my father's books, my mother's jewelry. Objects that connected me to the person I'd been before I became half of a couple that had never been as real as I'd believed. The mailbox at the end of my driveway bore only my name now, Laureen Holloway. Not Mrs. Jared Holloway, not Mrs. and Mrs. anyone, just my own name, claiming my own space in the world. I received letters occasionally from other victims of similar schemes, women who'd read about my case in the newspaper and wanted to share their own stories. Most of them had been less fortunate than I was. They'd been successfully committed to facilities like Millbrook Manor, their assets drained by family members who visited less and less frequently until they disappeared entirely from their loved ones' lives. Some of these women had spent years in psychiatric facilities, diagnosed with conditions they didn't have, medicated for symptoms they'd never experienced. Their families had them declared legally incompetent while systematically liquidating their assets, always with the explanation that the money was needed for specialized care. I'd started a small foundation to provide legal assistance for elder abuse victims, funding it with a portion of my settlement money. It wasn't enough to undo the damage that had been done to so many people, but it was a start. Spencer helped me manage the foundation's correspondence, screening requests for assistance and helping me identify cases where intervention might make a difference. The work gave my life a purpose I'd never had during my marriage. For 34 years, I'd defined myself through my relationship to Jared, as his wife, his support system, his partner in the life he'd designed for us both. Now, I was discovering what it meant to define myself through my own choices, my own values, my own vision of how the world should work. On quiet evenings, Spencer and I often sat on the back patio, sharing a bottle of wine and discussing the day's events. These conversations had a quality I'd never experienced in my marriage, the easy exchange between two people who genuinely respected each other's thoughts and opinions. "Do you ever regret it?" Spencer asked one evening as we watched the sun set over our small piece of land. "Leaving your old life behind so completely?" I considered the question seriously, sipping my wine as I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago. She'd lived in a bigger house, worn more expensive clothes, attended social events where she smiled and made polite conversation about topics that didn't interest her. She'd been married to a man who turned out to be planning her murder, but she'd also been part of a world that had seemed stable and predictable. "No," I said finally, "I don't regret it. That life was built on lies, Spencer. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about Jared, about my place in the world, none of it was real. How can you regret losing something that never existed?" Spencer nodded, understanding. He'd witnessed the slow revelation of Jared's true nature, watched me discover the extent of the deception that had shaped my adult life. He'd also seen me transform from a confused, frightened woman into someone who could face down her would-be murderer in a courtroom and expose his crimes with calm precision. "What you have now is real," he said simply. He was right. The cottage, the garden, the work I was doing through the foundation, my friendship with Spencer, all of it was built on truth rather than illusion. I knew exactly where I stood with everyone in my life, exactly what I could expect from each relationship, exactly what I was capable of achieving on my own. The independence was intoxicating. At 64, I was learning what it felt like to make decisions based on my own preferences rather than someone else's expectations. I could eat dinner at noon if I felt like it, plant vegetables instead of flowers, stay up all night reading without anyone commenting on the waste of electricity. Small freedoms, perhaps, but they added up to something larger, the right to exist as myself rather than as someone else's idea of who I should be. A year after the trials ended, I received an unexpected visitor. I was working in the garden when Spencer announced that someone was at the front door asking to speak with me. I found a woman in her early 40s standing on my porch, nervous but determined. "Mrs. Holloway? My name is Sarah Martinez. I think my father is trying to have my grandmother committed so he can access her inheritance. I read about your case in the newspaper, and I was wondering if you might be able to help me." I invited Sarah inside, listening as she told me a story that was depressingly familiar. An elderly woman with substantial assets, a family member with financial problems, mysterious episodes of confusion that seemed to coincide with the introduction of new medications, and a sudden urgency about the need for specialized care. "What do you want me to do?" I asked when she'd finished. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I just know that what's happening to my grandmother isn't right, and I don't know how to stop it. Everyone thinks I'm being paranoid because I don't trust my own father." I looked at this young woman who was fighting to protect someone she loved from the same kind of systematic abuse I'd experienced. She reminded me of myself in those terrifying days after Spencer's warning, when I'd known something was wrong but hadn't understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. "The first thing you need to understand," I told her, "is that you're not paranoid. If your instincts are telling you something is wrong, trust them. The second thing you need to know is that you're not alone." Over the next several hours, I walked Sarah through everything I'd learned about elder abuse schemes, how they worked, what documentation to look for, which professionals to trust, and most importantly, how to protect her grandmother while gathering evidence of the abuse. When she left that evening, Sarah had a plan of action and my promise of support through the foundation. 6 months later, she called to tell me that her father was in jail and her grandmother was safe, living in her own home with Sarah as her legal guardian. These victories became the currency of my new life. Each person we helped, each scheme we exposed, each family we kept together, felt like a small act of rebellion against the kind of evil that had nearly destroyed me. I couldn't undo what had been done to me, but I could use my experience to prevent the same thing from happening to others. Spencer and I developed a routine that suited us both. Mornings in the garden, afternoons working on foundation business, evenings reading or talking or simply enjoying the peace of our shared space. We traveled occasionally, trips to visit other elder abuse victims, conferences on legal advocacy, sometimes just weekend getaways to places we'd always wanted to see. I was happier at 65 than I'd ever been at 35, or 45 or 55. The contentment wasn't based on any external validation or relationship status. It came from the simple satisfaction of living authentically, of using my time and resources for purposes that mattered to me, of existing in the world as myself rather than as someone else's creation. On the second anniversary of the day Spencer had warned me not to go to Paris, we held a small celebration in the garden. Just the two of us, a bottle of good wine, and a toast to the life we'd built together, not as romantic partners, but as two people who had chosen to face the world honestly and help each other along the way. To second chances, Spencer said, raising his glass. To first chances, I corrected. To finally getting the chance to live the life I was meant to have. As the sun set over our roses, I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, confused, frightened, trusting in people who wanted to destroy her. That woman was gone now. Not because she'd been murdered as Jared had planned, but because she'd transformed into someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous to those who preyed on the vulnerable. I had survived. I had thrived. And I had made sure that others would have the same chance. It was, I thought, a life worth living. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.